Your worst enemy is yourself. And once you convince yourself that you want to get better and do something, that's the hardest part, is the mental piece, making the decision. And a lot of what people read is, you'll know when you're ready for a hip replacement because that's when you want it. I just encourage you to move that timeline up.
Hello, my name is Jeff Sankoff, and I am the TriDoc, an emergency physician, a triathlete, a triathlon coach, and multiple Ironman finisher, coming to you as always from beautiful, sunny Denver, Colorado. And this is the July 26th edition of the TriDoc podcast, and I'm so happy you can be here. I just recently got back from Salem, Oregon, where I had the opportunity to participate in the Oregon 70.3. And I have to say, it was pretty much everything that everyone led me to believe it would be. So I owe a hearty thanks and a recognition of my Patreon supporter, Rebecca Adamson, who has, for the last couple of years, been cajoling and convincing and selling me on this race. And she was correct. It was a race that I very much enjoyed. I am sad to report that, as has happened in many other 70.3 events and Ironman events and even shorter events, that an athlete unfortunately passed away during the swim and was retrieved from the water. Assistance was given, but unfortunately that athlete did not survive. I don't have any other information on that, but one can only assume this was the latest of a cardiac event that we unfortunately see on occasion in these races, and my heartfelt condolences go out to the family and any friends who were impacted by this. Now, the Oregon race is famous for a few reasons. The first of which is its well-known, very much current-assisted swim. I had an opportunity to experience that for myself on the Saturday before the race, when a group of life sport athletes, and then myself and Juliet Hockman, my friend, the fellow coach at Life Sport, and my compatriot who helps me with the Medical Mailbag, were all gathered together along the banks of the Willamette River. And I understand I'm probably not pronouncing that. I think it might be Willamette. So someone's going to have to let me know. I'm sure Juliet will. And we were all gathered along the banks of the river, and we were preparing to take our practice swim so that we would get a sense for how to manage the current in the race the next day. I had been told by another podcast listener, Brian Dunn, a gentleman who's in my age group, someone who I have raced against on numerous occasions, and he had raced Oregon last year. I reached out to him a couple of months ago to ask him for any insights he might have for this event, and he had given me a sense that the best place to be in the river in order to benefit from the current was the far left. And indeed, as we were standing on the shore, we were being given instructions to do exactly that. So we entered the water. We immediately made a diagonal beeline across the riverway. And once we got there, we stopped and popped up, and a friend of mine, Brian Villaret, who also is a listener of the show, said to me, "Okay, you're pretty much done." And this was after about 2 or 3 minutes of swimming. And I looked at him quizzically, but then I saw the bank whizzing by at a very high rate of speed and realized that he wasn't kidding. The swim took all of 19 minutes in that practice day, and this included a couple of times to pop up and chat and get some tips and tricks about how to manage sighting for race day. And it's quite an experience. The race itself, the current was a little bit slower, and so I was not faster as I thought I would be because I was intending to actually swim a little bit harder. But when the race actually took place, the current seemed to be a little bit lower, and so my time was about the same as it had been during my practice day. But I still found myself feeling after the race, questioning what the point is of having a triathlon with such a fast swim. Now, I know this is going to be a little bit controversial. I know that people like Rebecca are going to tell me to stop being a bit of a Scrooge here, but let me just put this out there and say, when we do a triathlon, the swim is kind of part of it. And if we're going to be doing these like super fast downriver swims, are we not shortchanging the experience? Are we not turning this into a little bit of, I don't know, a duathlon plus? I think we have to. There's several of these swims now, right? Chattanooga is famous for having a fast swim, although it's long. It's a 1.4 mile swim instead of 1.2. Augusta, very fast swim. Previously, my PR, where I swam 25 minutes several years ago, that's now been shattered by almost 6 minutes here in Oregon. The upcoming race in Tri-Cities is another one that's going to have a current assist in the Columbia River, although apparently not quite as fast as this one. And of course, Ironman California in the Sacramento River, also a current assisted, quite a fast swim. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not the world's fastest swimmer. I will take the current assist pretty much any time. But I do question, like, when the current is as strong as it is in the Willamette River, is that kind of pushing things maybe a little bit too far? There's no question the Oregon race is exceptionally popular, and not just because of the swim. It has a beautiful bike course and probably one of the best run courses I've ever done, because it is just through a beautiful park. It's shaded. It's just well supported. Just a really great run course. But let's face it, there's a lot of people who gravitate to this race because they know they're not going to have to do as much of a swim as they would in other races. And so I come back to my original question. Is this shortchanging the triathlon experience by essentially removing the swim? You don't really have to swim all that much in order to get out of the water under 30 minutes in this race. What do you think? I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on this. Are downriver swims diminishing the whole triathlon, I don't know, experience? Maybe experience is the wrong word, but is it diminishing triathlon? I'd be interested in your thoughts. You could send me an email and let me know what you think at tri_doc@icloud.com, or you can drop your comments into the Facebook group for the TriDoc podcast. If you're not a member already, I hope that you will consider becoming one. You can search for TriDoc podcast on Facebook, answer the 3 easy questions. I'll gain you admittance, and you will be able to ask your questions for the medical mailbag and put in your comments for questions like the one I just asked, and join the conversation there. Coming up on the program today, the medical mailbag with the aforementioned Juliet Hockman is going to be coming up in just a short minute with a question pertaining to the incidence of breast cancer and whether or not being more physically fit has an impact on the risk. Turns out there is quite a bit of research that suggests that doing exercise on a regular basis does in fact impact your lifetime risk of developing this very deadly, although somewhat treatable disease. And that discussion is coming up in just a short bit. Later on, I am joined by Doug Morris. Doug is a very successful age group triathlete, one who has participated in races all over the world and in all 50 states. His story is quite fascinating, and he wrote about it in a book that he self-published and is available on Amazon called Trying, Trying. And in that book, he details his story of discovery of the multisport world, how it has enabled him to enjoy his life as much as he has, and he talks to me in our interview about how he went through 2 hip replacements and has managed to find continuing joy at the age of 65, and how he's looking forward to spreading his joy and enthusiasm for triathlon to anyone who is willing to listen. That's coming up in just a short bit later. Before all of that, I want to take my customary moment to thank all of you who have decided that for about the price of a cup of coffee per month, you would like to support this podcast and become a Patreon supporter. Those who have get access to special bonus segments that come out about once every month or so, the most recent of which came out just last Friday and featured an interview with Canadian Olympian Matt Sharp, who joined me to have a very comprehensive discussion on the upcoming Olympic triathlon, both men and women, where he helped me understand who we should be watching, who his picks for the medal contenders were, and what might happen should a shark get loose under Paris. If you're not a Patreon supporter, you can learn more about what it entails and how you can even get a very exciting thank you gift in the form of a very cool BOCO TriDoc podcast running hat. You can find all of those details over at my Patreon website, which is www.patreon.com/TriDoc podcast. As always, I thank you in advance just for considering. It's time again for the medical mailbag, that segment of the program, and I'm joined by my friend, Coach Juliet Hockman from Life Sport Coaching, who is here once again. How are you doing today, Juliet?
I'm great, and I am so looking forward to seeing you in just a few days.
That's right. So I should just make a note for listeners. We are recording this early. The podcast episode comes out the Friday after the Oregon 70.3, but because of travel and because Juliet is going to be working at a women's bike camp that happens right after Oregon, we wanted to get this recording done before I left for Oregon. So we are recording this on the Wednesday. I leave on Friday. So just a couple of days away, and we will get to be in person. And you will know that, of course, because our social media feeds will be filled with selfies of the two of us.
That's exactly having the best time at one of the best races in North America.
Exactly. Juliet, we have a question. This one does not come from a listener. What's the question we're going to be answering today on the Medical Mailbag?
Yeah, so we see so frequently in the press that there are increasing number of proven links between cardiovascular fitness and various diseases, the decrease of heart disease. You could list probably 20 diseases that we tend to see at the end of our lives, and they are mitigated if individuals are fit. And you and I were talking about this the other day, and one that has come to the fore recently is the link between cardiorespiratory fitness and breast cancer in women, which, of course, adds another one to that arsenal. And I think that I would be really curious to learn more about what you did and what your team did when you researched this, and just to tell us a little bit more about that fairly newly discovered link.
Yeah, it's a really interesting link, one that apparently has been discovered and written about in the past, but I came across a paper recently when I was doing some research for Triathlete magazine, a publication who I write for on a regular basis, and I asked one of the new interns, Nina Takashima, to look into this a little bit further. And she did some amazing work and found some incredible data in a whole bunch of different journal articles that answer this question. The paper that I came across initially was published this very year, and it's titled The Association Between Cardiorespiratory Fitness and the Risk of Breast Cancer in Women. Seems like it's going to answer the question very nicely. And this was a retrospective study of female participants, a very large study, almost 45,000 women. And what they did is they used data that was collected through the U.S. Veterans Hospital Association between 1999 and 2020. And they took all this huge data set and they looked backwards to see two things, really. The first was how fit were these women in the study? And then how many of them went on over the period that they had collected data, which was around 20 years, how many of them went on to develop breast cancer? So in the year 2020, how many of the women had breast cancer and how many had a recorded episode of breast cancer over those 20 years? And then comparing that to a standardized fitness test that any of the women had had. So they started with 45,000 women. When they drilled down to how many of them had actually had exercise testing, that number became a little bit less, but it still was quite large. So it was a very large study, and this comprised women all the way from age 30 to age 95. And they looked at the exercise testing, and it was standardized treadmill testing. This is done for cardiovascular reasons. The way it uses what's called a standardized Bruce protocol. They put these women on a treadmill test and they increase the amount of effort they're exerting. And that effort is measured in what's called metabolic equivalents, or METs. And each MET is equivalent to about 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram. And that will probably sound familiar because that is essentially VO2 max, right? That's our VO2 max. If you are operating at 2 METs, you are consuming 7 mils of oxygen per kilogram. That makes sense? So if your VO2 max is 24, and most age group triathletes are going to have a VO2 max that's higher than that, but if yours is 24, then that means you're going to be able to complete a Bruce protocol exercise treadmill test to at least 7 METs, because 7 times 3.5 is 21. Right. So you're over 24. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So they had these women, they categorized them based on how many METs they could do. And they categorized them into a least fit category. And that was considered to be the reference, sort of the controls. And then they compared them into a low fit, based on how many METs they were able to complete, moderate fit, and fit cohorts. And then what they did is they looked and said, okay, how many of the women in each of these categories had breast cancer? And it turns out that being increasingly fit showed a very important protective effect against the development of breast cancer. With every one metabolic equivalent, with every 3.5 increase in your VO2 max, your risk of developing breast cancer was 7% lower. Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot.
Yeah,
so
good
again,
odds
this
for
is
Vegas.
right. So that again is compared. So let's just put this into context. Your lifetime risk of developing breast cancer across the board is about 10%. So 1 in 10 women will develop breast cancer. If you are more fit, then if you have a higher VO2 max, then you can decrease that by 7%. That's relative. That doesn't mean you go from 10% to 3%.
3%.
It means you go from 10% to 7% of 10, which is 0.07. So you go down to just about 9.3%, right? And then if you increase that by another MET, then you go down another 7%, which it's as you get more and more fit, the amount of benefit becomes less because 7% of 9.3% is less than 7% of 10. Does that make sense? It's not an absolute decrease at 7%. It's a relative decrease at 7%, but still, that is a very substantial. Who wouldn't take a 7% lower risk of developing breast cancer? And this was across the board in all of the women in this study. And I want to point out
I have a question.
that,
Did it just so happen that because all of these women were somehow associated with the military, all of them had this treadmill test during their lifetime? Because this is a retroactive test, a retrospective. And so they had to work with what had already happened with these women. So
right.
Was it just that all of these women, because a lot of them were probably military, had some sort of a test?
So that's a really important point, and that's one of the limitations of doing a retrospective study. You're stuck with the data that you have, and you can't do anything. You have to use the data that you have. So let's just take a moment to compare this kind of study and its strengths versus the kind of study we've talked about frequently, which is the prospective study. We've said many times, if you want to compare a supplement, for example, if you want to say whether or not spirulina is a good supplement to use, the best way to do that is to do what's called a randomized controlled trial. You take 100 people, 50 of them get a placebo, 50 of them get the spirulina. Nobody in the group knows what they're getting. None of the investigators know who is getting the placebo, knows who is getting the spirulina. And then you just put them through this protocol over a predetermined amount of time. And at the end, you just evaluate them and you see what the outcomes were. That is the best kind of study to determine the impact of a specific intervention. The problem is breast cancer takes a very long time to develop. And to do a prospective study on breast cancer, if you were going to do this kind of study prospectively, this was 20 years of data.
Yeah,
if I was going to take 50,000 women, get their exercise trust at the beginning, and then follow them for 20 years, I wouldn't have this result for another 20 years. Who knows what's going to happen to those researchers? Who knows what's going to happen to the funding of this study? It's just impossible to do. So instead, these researchers make use of a very robust data set. And this is the strength of this study because it was done by a government, a federal body like the Veterans Administration. They know that all of the people in it were getting these treadmill tests because it was part of their initial enrollment. And they know that they're going to be surveyed on an annual basis. So the data set is very complete and they can make some pretty good determinations. But one of the major problems with these retrospective studies is you're limited by the data set itself. So for example, this was a population of women who were all military. So that means
Hold on, we may not know that. We may not know that though. I was thinking about this when you're describing the study, because first of all, I think that veteran families can also go to the VA as part of the benefits. I'm not sure. That'd be something worth looking at. But then you also said these women between 30 and 95 years old. Women, the first women to serve in the U.S. military were nurses in Vietnam. And so the older end of that study would not have even served as nurses, and let alone more active duties. So I'm just
Completely fair. I guess what I'm getting at, and here's what I'm getting at. The population in this study doesn't necessarily reflect the general population. It reflects
100%.
a population that is a veterans
Narrow.
population, a veterans
Yeah, it's
administrator.
narrow.
So, for example, the mean age is 55. And that goes to what you're saying, right? It skews younger because the mean age in the United States, I believe, might be higher than that of women.
Okay.
I could be
Okay.
wrong. Or this might be older because it skews to an older veterans population. I don't know. 60% white, 33% black, 4.9% Hispanic, and 3.6% Native American. And we know the population of the United States, I believe, is not 3.6% Native American. I believe it's smaller. So this population skews a little bit in terms of its ethnic breakdown and possibly its age breakdown. And that's really all I meant to point out, is just that with these kinds of data sets, you're a bit limited by what's in the data set. You're also limited by how good the quality of the data recording was. Now, with the Veterans Administration data, I think we're pretty secure that it's good data collection. But we also don't know, for example, because the exercise treadmill test was done at the beginning, it wasn't repeated over the course of the study. So we don't know if these women stayed fit. We just know if they were fit at the beginning. Still, it's a very interesting association that if you were, and that's another thing about retrospective studies, you can never determine causality. You can only make associations. Prospective studies, you can determine causality. And what I mean by that is we can say that the more fit women had an associated decreased risk of breast cancer. It didn't mean that being more fit absolutely caused a decreased risk of breast cancer. We can only say that with prospective studies. Still, pretty impressive results here, demonstrating that when women enrolled in the study more fit than less, their likelihood of developing breast cancer later was lower. And the researchers who wrote this paper came up with a few theories as to why this might be. And it all has to do with hormones. And we recognize that breast cancer is one of the cancers that is exquisitely sensitive to estrogen. And I mentioned a little bit earlier, I said that your lifetime sort of global risk of cancer is 1 in 10. That is across the board, but there are some women for whom the risk is significantly higher. For example, if you're born with the BRCA gene, we know that gene is associated with almost a 50% risk. That obviously, we don't know if exercise is going to affect that specifically because that is not a data point that was collected in this paper. So I can't speak to whether or not if you have the BRCA gene, improved fitness is going to decrease your risk. But we do know, at least through the theories that these researchers have posited, and again, these haven't been tested, these are just theories, they said that one of the reasons they think that being more fit can decrease breast cancer is because we know that physical activity decreases circulating estrogen. Physical activity reduces insulin-like growth factors. Insulin-like growth factors are hormones and different signals within the body that have been associated with things like putting on weight, but also have been associated with stimulating cell multiplication that can be associated with cancer. Again, total theory. This is just hypothesis. Physical activity has immunomodulatory effects. We know, we've talked about how physical activity can decrease inflammatory effects, and we know that inflammation can have impact on our cells, and there is a purported link between long-term inflammation and both autoimmune disease and possible neoplasms. And then finally, and this was a big one, physical activity causes favorable changes in adiposity, and our fat cells, especially in women, are a source of estrogen. And it is thought, especially in postmenopausal women, that by having a more favorable balance between muscle and fat can decrease the likelihood of breast cancer in postmenopausal women. And we're going to come to that in one of the other studies we found.
But that's the adiposity argument. Don't we know that cancer is increased in people who are carrying extra weight anyway? And so that's not
Again, this is a theory. This is just one of the hypotheses they put out there. And we know that being overweight definitely is associated with certain cancers. Is it associated because of the estrogen link? I don't know. That's one of those things that's never been answered. A second study, this is interesting because we're going to come to some conflicts now between the papers. So here's a study, association between estimated cardiorespiratory fitness and breast cancer, a prospective cohort study. This one is prospective, so it didn't follow women for quite as long. It did have a very large number, though, 18,000 women. And interestingly, also found a very impressive decrease in the risk of developing breast cancer. But it didn't follow the women for quite as long. So it didn't have that big, long 20-year run-up. So the incidence of breast cancer was going to be a bit lower. But very impressive. They found that body fat and BMI were the really major things that influenced whether or not exercise impacted your risk of breast cancer when you exercise. And in this paper, they found that there was just a huge protective effect of fitness for breast cancer, but only in the subset of women who were overweight, which is interesting. And I say it's interesting because another paper found exactly the opposite. Another paper found that, and this one is called A Prospective Study of Cardiorespiratory Fitness and Breast Cancer Mortality, came out in 2009. So we're going back a little bit of a ways here. Also found very impressive and important protective effects of being fit. But this one found that it was much more impressive amongst younger women who had normal weight and in women who had never used oral contraceptives. So this paper was a little bit of an outlier. It is a little bit of an older paper, so not totally clear what to make of it. But one more paper I want to mention because it was particularly interesting, and it's called Inherent Aerobic Capacity Dependent Differences in Breast Carcinogenesis. And it's an interesting paper. So this is an animal study. They bred rats, selecting for specific genes that are known to be associated with inherent aerobic capacity. And so they had a group of rats that were known to be like athletes.
Super rats. They were super rats.
Super rats. And then they bred a group of rats who were just like average. And it turned out that the rats who were super athletic had a much lower risk of breast cancer. And they couldn't really explain why, because nothing that these genes coded for had anything to do with the development of breast cancer. And they went on to suggest that they think it's possible that part of the reason exercise protects against breast cancer might be genetic. If you are genetically a good athlete, you might just also happen to have a genetically lower risk of breast cancer, which I thought was
That's really interesting. Huh.
So not only are you gifted with the ability to be a phenomenal athlete, you're gifted with a lower risk of breast cancer. Now, again, this is a single animal study. We can only extrapolate so much from it. None of the other studies have actually looked at the genetics of the women who developed and didn't develop. So we can't say if any of this, but I thought it was very interesting. And just
I'm still stuck
on the whole,
on
the topic is
how do they make the rats get breast cancer? Do they then inject them with a cancerous, or do they just wait around to see if these rats get breast cancer or not?
It's so interesting that you ask. I wanted to hide that part from you, but since you ask, they were injected with a carcinogen.
I'm sorry, rats. I shouldn't be laughing, but I'm just thinking of these researchers in this lab waiting for these rats to get breast cancer.
The things that we've determined in animal studies, right? Swimming with weights attached, running on inescapable treadmills.
The underwater treadmills,
Yeah, they were injected with carcinogens. And if you were a better athlete, you were less likely to develop cancer from the carcinogen. That you were resistant to cancer formation.
As long as they don't release these uninfected super rats into the sewers, we're good. I'm feeling good about that.
That's a good point. You raise a very good point.
All right. So basically, sounds like, although this is a retrospective study and perhaps not as, robust as looking forward, where we can follow 100 women, 1,000 women, 10,000 women over the next 20 years, signs are still good. Indications are still good that, once again, we have huge benefit health effects from being fit. I think that's what we're looking at, top line.
And it's really hard to argue with such impressive benefits, right? We're never going to get a really equivalent kind of prospective study on this. And I kind of wonder if we're ever going to get the answer to all of those hypotheses as to which one is accurate, but I don't really think it matters. I think that we continue to see the benefits of being fit. There were some breakdowns in a couple of these studies that showed that the benefits were even more in postmenopausal women, demonstrating yet again how important it is to stay active in the peri and postmenopausal periods for your global health, not just for all of the other reasons we've talked about, but we know how devastating an impact breast cancer has. We're recording this just a couple of days after Shannon Doherty passed away, a young woman, I guess 50s, still young as far as I'm concerned. But breast cancer continues to exact a toll, even though the survival rates and the treatments have advanced really dramatically. It is still one of the more depressing cancers because it does, when it's detected, it often has already spread and it's already difficult to treat. So if you can reduce your risk just by doing the thing you love, and if you're listening to this podcast, I'm guessing that you're one of those people who are staying active, keep going. And I want to point out again, based on that first study, and there was another study here, one of the other studies I reviewed talks about just maintaining, see if I could find it here, but one of the studies I reviewed here talked about all you have to do is maintain a VO2 max that would get you to 8 METs. So a metabolic equivalent of 8. So 8 times 3.5, remember each MET is 3.5. 8 times 3.5 is 24, is 28. So if you could keep a VO2 max of 28, and they suggest that in order to keep a VO2 max of 28, you only need to be exercising 30 minutes a day. And that's not high intensity. That's just reasonable, moderate intensity exercises of 30 minutes a day can get you to about a VO2 max of 28. You're in business. You're going to dramatically decrease your risk of breast cancer over the duration of your life. And to me, that's a very easy trade to make.
So I have a question. You can cut this out if you want, because it might be getting too into the weeds, but would you have to make a prospective study work? Do you really have to follow women for that long? What if we know that the incidence of breast cancer increases dramatically as we get older, right? The 20 to 30 group has X%, and then as you go up each decade or each even 5-year age group, women are more and more likely to be diagnosed with breast cancer. So couldn't you follow a group of women starting at 65 who came in fit? So you had a control group of people who represented the normal US population, and then you had another group of people who came in who were lifelong active individuals, and then follow those two groups and see what happened over the next?
You can, but just consider the fact that research funding is very fickle. It's not always reliable. And keeping the researchers and keeping the database and keeping all of the people involved, because remember, you have to study a lot of people, right? If the incidence of cancer is 1 in 10, and you want to be able to measure an effect, you're going to need thousands of women, and being able to track all these women, because stuff happens, right? Where they live one day, you don't know where they live the next. And you have to be able to follow hospital records, because when someone dies, you have to be able to know that. And it's really hard to do these studies prospectively, but they do happen. The Framingham study is a great example. It's Framingham, Massachusetts. It's been ongoing for over 50 years now, and they continually publish results out of it. And they say, oh, here's the latest data from the Framingham study. Here's what we found. So it does happen, but it's very difficult, very expensive. And when you're talking about things that take a very long time, like cancer, it's a 1 in 10 over your lifetime. It's not 1 in 10 over the next year. So it's just really fraught and really difficult to do, but it does happen. And yes, I'm sure there is probably someone out there maybe doing this, but it's much easier to do it in a retrospective fashion, especially when there are these very robust data sets being constructed already. But that's the problem with doing research on populations that have diseases that take a long time to develop. But they're out there. They do happen occasionally.
Yeah.
This was yet another fascinating conversation. And I'm happy to say that we have a couple of listener questions lined up for the next couple of podcast episodes. So if you have a question that you would like for us to answer, I hope that you will reach out and send it in. You can email me at tri_doc@icloud.com. You can also head over to the private Facebook group that is found on that platform. Just search for the TriDoc Podcast, answers the 3 easy questions. I'll gain you admittance. You could ask your question there. And of course, you could join the conversation about all the other things podcast related and otherwise. We'd love to hear from you. Until the next episode, Juliet, I will wish you well. I look forward to seeing you in a couple of days, and good luck to everyone who did Oregon. We're talking, you'll be hearing this after Oregon comes out.
Yeah,
so
right.
Hopefully you had a great day if you were there. Take care, Juliet. We'll see you next time.
Thanks so much, Jeff.
My guest on the podcast today is Doug Morris. He is a coach and an author, as well as a very successful age group triathlete. He lives with his wife, Chris, and their two intellectually disabled, multi-talented daughters in the Chicago area. Doug learned to overcome adversity to achieve business, marriage, parenting, and triathlon racing goals. He met exceptional people while living in various states and, very coolly, in Thailand, in Bangkok. His ambition is to mentor others on a personalized journey to achieve extraordinary outcomes while working himself out of a job. He is the author of the book Trying, spelled T-R-I, apostrophe I-N-G, a journey of discovery, challenges, and camaraderie while racing in 50 states and the continents beyond. Doug has also had both of his hips replaced, one in 2018 and one in 2023, but he continues to race and at a high level, including the USAT Short Course Nationals just a few weeks ago, where he finished second in 3 events and 8th in a 4th. And he went to Brazil recently to participate in the 70.3 in Rio, where he won his age group. And he's going to be in Taupo for the 70.3 World Championships, fortunately, in an age group above mine. So I don't have to worry about competing against him. But for now, Doug, welcome to the TriDoc podcast. It's a pleasure to connect with you here.
Thanks, Jeff. I really feel appreciated being on the TriDoc podcast with you today.
I want to hear, first and foremost, I read a little bit of your book. I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing, but you've had, like me, a very long journey through this sport. Tell me what got you to it in the first place, and what were some of the valuable lessons you learned in your first few years?
What got me there in the first place, I was dating somebody who was a swimmer, and I was a runner. And she suggested, let's do the Chicago Triathlon. So all the way back in 1986, we went out and bought bicycles and did a little bit of training. And I did the race. My dating partner backed out. He wasn't quite ready. And after the first race, I was truly hooked to triathloning. And I've been doing it for 38 years. The second race I did, my girlfriend did join me. And about a year and a half later, we got married. And we've been happily married for 30 years.
And is she still a triathlete to this day, or is she the Sherpa?
She is the Sherpa, and a very good one at that. She's not nearly as competitive as I am. She's more of a recreational athlete, but she has been my support team for a long time and a really good one. And to answer your other question, I have learned so much about the sport, about making me be a better person, and all the travels that I've done throughout the U.S. and the world. It's really opened up my eyes to a whole bunch of different things that I never knew existed, and reaffirmed a lot of things that I did see that I knew about. But it's been a lot of fun.
I know that for me, triathlon is so much more than just a sport. It's a lifestyle. It's also a community. I've always viewed it as an incredibly positive influence in my life. I'm sure you feel the same way, having been with it for as long as you have. Can you think, looking back now on those 38 years, what are 2 or 3 kind of elements of triathlon that keep you in it for as long as you've been going through hip replacements and everything else? What are the things that keep bringing you back to train and to race in this crazy sport?
I think the biggest thing is the camaraderie. The other triathletes that I've met, I really do have some long-term friendships. We actually get together at races both here in the U.S. and elsewhere. So camaraderie has been the biggest thing. And it's just not the triathletes, it's the volunteers, it's the race directors, even the sponsors. And you get some known things across the races. That's one thing that stands out. The other thing is a great motivation to not only develop my racing skills, but realize how much the racing has helped me become a better person, a better spouse to my wife, a better parent to my 2 kids, and hopefully just a better person to be around, both in my local community, but really a world citizen. And the third thing is I started picking up races to travel to, and that was a motivation to see more of the U.S., which is just a beautiful country. I think it's probably the neatest one in the whole world, but also to force myself into pushing into new things and doing races in other countries around the world.
And over those 38 years, I'm sure you've covered all the different distances. I know you've done at least up to 70.3. Can you think of 5 races that kind of stick out as not necessarily your favorite because of how you did, but just your favorite races in general?
Yeah. So I remember reading a long time ago that if you can't decide on one thing that's your favorite in life, you're just going to be miserable. And so I've decided I'm going to be miserable for the rest of my life. Because it's so neat. The first one was really cool because I was a runner and I thought that's all I was. And all of a sudden I realized I could do a lot more different sports, but also just push my body a lot more than ever expected. So Chicago, it was the Bud Light triathlon. That really stood out. The one I did in Thailand when we first moved over there, whole new world of language, how the races were much different than how USAT or way back TriFed used to run the race. So that stood out. On my course to get qualified for Kona, I was in Australia, and talk about a very competitive environment. And they like to have a lot of fun after those competitive races. So Ironman Australia really stood out. I think anybody that has done Kona, no matter how well you do or how well you don't do, it's just a great place to compete, to go. You see all these people who you thought were just icons online, or for me, a magazine way back in the 90s. There they were in real life, tearing down the road. And fifth one I'd throw in there, which is all around is probably my favorite, was the triathlon in Washington, D.C. I like history. My wife went with me. She had never been. And it's just like walking into a real life history book. And so those are the top 5 that probably stand out, Jeff.
And you're looking more recently, going through those hip replacements couldn't have been easy. They had to have obviously made you take some forced downtime. I myself went through some forced downtime last year when I had to have surgery for not a joint replacement, but something else entirely. It's something that as triathletes, we all struggle with. We're so used to being active. Training becomes part of our daily routine. How did you manage to go through those periods where you were obviously first encountering just the symptoms of not being able to perform as well as you wanted to because you had increasing issues related to the hip, and then had to have the surgery and then deal with that comeback and the rehab and everything? How mentally did you manage to get through all of it and stay positive and be able to get back to where you are now, where you're out competing with 2 artificial hips and having as much success as you are?
I'll tell you what, it was damn tough. I was on this journey to race in all 50 states, accomplished that, and decided to go ahead and do the world since we had lived in Thailand. And on the last race, just before it, actually, I started to have a groin, and it hurt so bad that I didn't really do as well as I wanted when I wrapped up the original journey. And then I was on my training bike inside because it was winter, and I actually was trying to get my leg over, and the bike fell on me. And I go, you know what? This isn't a simple injury. Something's going on. So I went off and saw a doctor, found out I had 2 arthritic hips. The left one really hurt. And I go, okay, what's the next step? And he said, when you're ready, just come on back and we'll do surgery. And I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready for 2.5 years. I was mad at the world. I couldn't run. It hurt so bad. I thought the world was just going to crater in. And you said, how do you come back positive? I was very negative for 2.5 years. And finally made the commitment to get it done. Everybody said the worst thing about any type of hip replacement or knee replacement is the time before you get it done. And I talked to 4 different surgeons in 4 different places over that 2.5 years. And I wasn't looking for someone who said, hey, it's okay to go back and run or go back and get in triathlon. I was looking for someone who actually knew what the possible solutions were. And the storyline changed as the years progressed. A little bit more technology came out and a little bit more history of new things or things that had been done on hip replacement seemed to get better. And Jeff, I'm sure you can relate as a doctor, but I did find a doctor down at University Medical Center, Dr. Stephen Duncan, and he said, Doug, here's the technology. We can get you back to doing what you love. And he knew that I loved triathlons, and he had actually performed the surgery on another triathlete about a year and a half ahead of time. I talked to her, and she was like my canary in the coal mine. And that's what got me there. I followed his advice of not running for 6 months and laying off from swimming and biking for 6 weeks. I went through all the PT, and I was scared shitless when I came back and started trying to really do stuff on my hip. But I followed his direction, and 9 months later, I did my first Ironman 70.3, and it didn't hurt. And it was really my first competition of a pain-free hip in over 4 years. So that's where I was at.
And you got another, 4.5 years till you had to do the other one. So was it easier to pull the trigger to get the second hip done?
Absolutely. So when I went in and saw Dr. Duncan for the first time and talked to their PA, they had looked at my x-rays and they go, oh, you're here for your right hip. And I go, no, my right hip's fine. There's no pain. My left one. And they look at me and go, that will change. And 4 years later and about 15 races later, the right one was stiffening up. Range of motion kept on getting less and less. It wasn't identical to the left hip, but I knew what was going on. I knew I had a timeline. And so I had gone over to Europe and raced and came back. And I got 2 workouts in. On the third one, I got a mile from the house. And I said, you know what? That's it. It's time to get the right hip done. And that day I called the doctor and said, can you put me on the schedule? I'm going to change insurance plans. And they got me on there. So that one was a real quick.
And I imagine your mindset must have been completely different. You having had the experience of one hip going so well, knowing that you came back relatively quickly and feeling so good about it, it must have been a totally different. Instead of having 2.5 years of hating the world, you probably instead were much more positive about it, I'm guessing.
Oh, 100% more positive. I couldn't wait for the calendar in its 6 months to run its course and get back running. For 3.5 years, 4 years, I woke up every morning and was very grateful for doctors, for all the medical people, for technology on being able to replace the left one. But I was still scared that any day it was just going to crater in on me because I did go back to the sport. When the right one got redone and I was up and running, literally, I don't even think about it anymore. I literally don't think that I've had hip replacement. And that was just such a weird feeling. And when I left after the second one, they go, probably unlikely you're going to have twins. You're actually going to have like stepsisters or first cousin on your hips because they don't come back identically. But I literally feel as good as I did when I was running in my 50s. I got to tell you, technology and people who know their stuff and apply it well, it's amazing what they can do.
So what's your recommendation? I'm sure there's a listener out there somewhere who's probably dealing with some kind of chronic joint issues. And I want to emphasize, I know from my being in the medical field, hips are a different story than knees.
Yeah.
Knees are a much more difficult rehab. Knees are a significantly difficult. They're a different story. So I want to make sure people know we're talking about hips here. But if you're out there and you're listening to this and you've been dealing with hip issues, maybe you had a labral issue when you were younger and you didn't get it repaired because there's no guarantee that getting a labral repair is going to prevent osteoarthritis. But let's say you chose not to deal with it. And now, many years later, you're now having some onset of osteoarthritis and you're wondering what you should do. What's your advice to that person, Doug? Because they're probably sitting there really struggling with this dilemma because they're probably feeling like you did that before that first hip surgery.
First of all, I'll offer up, give me a call, track me down on email. Be more than happy to share with you more details, answer any questions you have. And that's what I did, is I talked to people and got comfortable with that. Second is get over your fear as quickly as possible. Quickly as you can, because the medicine, the technology is out there. Your worst enemy is yourself. And once you convince yourself that you want to get better and do something, that's the hardest part, is the mental piece, making the decision. And a lot of what people read is you'll know when you're ready for a hip replacement because that's when you want it. I just encourage you to move that timeline up from 3.5 years of what I struggled with to 3.5 months to get on the doctor's calendar to get on with your life and enjoy it.
Yeah, that's great advice. I want to move on to something else that you have done that probably took a little more than 3.5 years, and that's writing this book. Tell us about what got you to write Trying and what it's about and what it did for you as a process.
Sure. So the book, I think, took 6 years. I really don't want to admit or think back exactly how long, but it was a lot longer than I ever expected. So I had moved around a lot. First race was in Chicago. I was living in Kansas. And so then I did races in Kansas and Missouri and moved up to Iowa. So I did a race there, came back to Chicago, had some stuff in Indiana where I grew up, and Wisconsin, which was nearby, then went out to Washington, lived in Seattle for a while. And then I got a job over in Bangkok and I did Kona. That was my 14th state. And I lost a lot of motivation. Like, where do I go with the sport? And I had a high school friend that did a marathon in 50 states. I could be the very first person to do a triathlon in all 50 states. So I did a little bit of research and realized, no, 2 people had already done it. And I said, okay, I'll be motivated to do it anyway. And then living in Bangkok, it was hard to fly back and definitely unaffordable to fly back and do the States. I said, I'll just do some international stuff while I can, knowing I'd get back to the States. Anyway, that's when I decided the journey. My mother-in-law said, hey, you should write a book about this. And dumb things just stick in my mind. And so I go, okay, maybe I could. I always like to write. I'm not a great writer, but I wanted to share just how much fun, how much you could learn, how much better you can get by doing this stuff and what it's like to see the world. So it's a very detailed book. I had another triathlete do editing on it to make sure that it was something that would be interested. It's highly geared towards triathletes or family friends, spectators, sponsors, owners, and race directors, etc. And I wanted to share what soundtrack of life, storyboard of life could be for a triathlete if they just set up some long-term goals to reach and keep them motivated in the sport that we all love.
What are your long-term goals now? I know you're headed to Taupo this year. I'm looking forward to, actually, it's funny now that I think about it, there are many previous guests of this program who will be in Taupo. We're going to have set up some kind of get-together when we're there. But what are your long-term goals for Taupo, for beyond?
I just want to see the world. And so I tracked down races that would be in places that I want to see. And that's my long-term goal. I'm 65, body's wearing down, that's for sure. I'm going to slow down a little bit. But I've been to New Zealand, but I've never raced there. So that's on board. I just got back yesterday from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, like you had mentioned. That was my 21st different country of doing a triathlon. And I'm doing it for me. I don't expect my book to be a big seller. I do expect that any triathlete that would take the time and read it, they would really enjoy it. And hopefully someone in their teens and early 20s will read this stuff and not only get the motivation to do triathlons in their life, but keep at it, make it a lifelong sport, and use it also as motivation to see the world. Because there's just a lot of cool places out there and a lot of really cool places here in the States to visit, experience, and really enjoy.
When you say the body's wearing down, what does that look like? What do you mean by that? Because I know for me, 57 years old, I definitely feel different than I did even 2-3 years ago. And it's interesting to me. I just accept it. It's a fact of life. It is the way it is, what it is. But what does it look like at 65?
Other than then, I hate looking at my watch. It feels pretty cool. I'm very grateful just to be doing this at 65. Jeff, that's a great question, but I've actually never really thought about it. I know we have a finite amount of years to live, but I like to cram a lot of things in my life, and I keep my family busy. My 2 intellectual kids, we went over and took that expat assignment in Bangkok. People thought we were crazy because there was not a lot of services, but they came back understanding the world much better than what their peer group would have been here, and even what their normal cousins. They just couldn't understand a lot of the world stuff that we talk about and what they were exposed to. So that's been the motivation. Actually had my oldest daughter, she's volunteered, I think, at 10 different races. They've probably gone to about a third of the stuff on the journey. The younger one has seen a lot of stuff too. No, I'm rambling, getting off your question a little bit, but
Okay, it's a good ramble. I feel like you do. I feel like triathlon has given me so much and has opened many doors. It's allowed me as well to inspire my children, and they are getting a lot out of that.
Right.
And so I share your enthusiasm for all of the things around triathlon.
Yeah.
Do you foresee yourself sticking with it? I know a couple of people who I greatly admire who are in the late 70s age group and doing very well. And Natalie Grabeau is one of them. John Snelling is another. They are amazingly impressive to me, not so much just because they're accomplishing great things at that age, but because I think we all aspire to be in our late 70s and as youthful as they are. Do you think that this is something you'll stick with as you continue to age and continue to move into your late 60s and early 70s?
absolutely. I may not race as much. I'm going to be doing something. And I really love racing, and I really like triathlon. I like the people in the sport, and the kids like it, and I take them with me until I can't walk. I really do. Because if I'm not doing this, I'm going to be doing something else. And the alternatives I don't like as well. So why not keep the stuff you like, right?
Absolutely. And with the few minutes that we have left, tell me about what you're doing as a coach.
I always wanted to be a coach when I was in my teens, probably a track coach back then. And then I realized that probably wouldn't pay the bills. So I turned into a businessman, and how I managed people, how I led people, I really put on my coaching hat with them. And finally, after I retired, I just picked up coaching. Not a serious coach like you. I thought I'd build up a lot of business from a website. That didn't happen. Thought I'd build up a lot of business from the book. That didn't happen. So reality has settled in that I've got a few athletes. I do a lot of pro bono stuff here for people in my hometown and people that I've met at races. And to me, I think that's a lot more fulfilling than trying to run the business like a real business. So that's pretty good.
I love to hear that. And I'm sure people are benefiting from your experience and from your exuberance for the sport. And there's nothing better than that. And really embodying all the things you've talked about, the camaraderie of the sport, the giving back, and just the community.
Absolutely. And for me right now, there's nothing better for my motivation than seeing other people really get motivated. They create such a great vibe for not only for triathlon, but for life in general. And at 65, you look at life much differently than you do at 25. They make me feel young, and I like that. And so it's a good sharing. It's a symbiotic relationship for sure.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. What do you have on then for the rest of the summer? I know that we've talked about Taupo a couple of times, but that's not till December. So what do you have going on until then?
I just wanted to get through the U.S. Multisport Nationals, which was 3 weeks ago. I wanted to get down to Brazil and back. And next up is 2 races in Atlantic City in September. So that's National, Olympic, and Sprint. But I'm going to pull out the calendar and look in the checking account and see how much money I have and see if I can get a few more destination races on the calendar. I'm not there yet.
That's awesome. And where can people find your book? Where can people find out more about you? I will obviously have links in the show notes, but just give a shout for where they can find any info about your book and you.
Yes, the book is available at Amazon. That's the only place it is available unless you get a copy from someone that's already bought it. I used to have a coaching website, but I've taken it down. It's just not worth it. If you really want to get a hold of me, do the simple Google search and you can find phone numbers out there. But give me a call and I'll help you out with your hips or anything along those lines and share some stories with you. Good stories.
All right, Doug. Thanks for all of that. Doug Morris is a coach. He's an author. He's a triathlete. He is really an embodiment of all the things that triathlon is in terms of community and just exuberance for life. And I can't thank you enough for being here on the TriDoc podcast today. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you for having me.
Hi, my name is Justin Rayfield, and I'm a proud Patreon supporter of the TriDoc podcast, the only show that's more addictive than carbs before a long workout. Produced and edited by the one and only Jeff Stankoff, along with this dynamic duo of interns, Cosette Rhodes and Nina Takashima, who are so amazing they make superheroes look like they're on a coffee break. If you're looking for the scoop on all things discussed today, dash over to www.tridocpodcast.com for show notes and a treasure trove of past episodes. Got a burning question that's keeping you up at night? Or maybe just something you're curious about? Fire off an email to Jeff at try_doc@icloud.com. And who knows, your question might just be the star of a future episode. If you're on the hunt for coaching services that'll make you faster than a greased lightning bolt, zip on over to try.coaching.com or lifesportcoaching.com. Trust me, it's like finding a shortcut in a May. You'll thank me later. Lastly, don't just stalk your ex on social media. Follow Jeff too. Catch all the action on the TriDoc Podcast Facebook page, double tap those pics on TriDoc Coaching Instagram, and binge watch the TriDoc Coaching YouTube channel. And hey, why not join the cool kids in the TriDoc Podcast private Facebook group? Just search, click, and you're in. If this podcast tickles your funny bone or pumps up your adrenaline, show some love with a rating and review. Subscribe to never miss out on the fun. If you're feeling extra generous, become a Patreon fan of podcast at patreon.com/TriDoc Podcast. And lastly, I want to give a big shout out to Radio by Empty Hours for the killer intro and outro music, used with a high five and a thank you. Discover them and other indie gems at www.reverbnation.com and support the little guys making big waves. The TriDoc Podcast will be back on faster than you can say, is it race day yet? With more medical music and another chat with the multisport maven. Until then, train like a beast and enjoy the podcast.